What happens when the past you've tried to forget suddenly finds you? For Jack Miller, an ordinary work trip becomes the first step on an extraordinary journey when his hotel room contains an impossible surprise. A photograph of his brother who vanished 20 years ago without a trace. A single image, a hidden message, a mystery decades in the making. As Jack's hands begin to shake, holding the impossible photograph, he's pulled into a trail of clues that someone has carefully laid out for him to follow. But who would go to such lengths to reunite two brothers? And why now, after all these years? Some bonds can never truly be broken, even by time, distance, or painful memories. Jack Miller watched the dusty streets of Pinewood slide past the bus window. His back hurt from the 6-hour ride, and he was ready to get off. He wasn't used to sitting still for so long. As a carpenter, he spent his days moving, building, fixing. The bus wheezed to a stop in front of a faded sign that read, "Pinewood Bus Station." "Finally," Jack muttered. He grabbed his worn duffel bag from the overhead rack and made his way down the narrow aisle. "Enjoy your stay," the driver said, as Jack stepped down onto the sidewalk. Jack nodded and looked around. Pinewood was smaller than he expected. A single main street with shops on both sides. A diner, a hardware store, a small grocery, and at the far end, the Pinewood Hotel. It wasn't much, but he only needed to stay for a week to finish the cabinet job that had brought him here. The late afternoon sun beat down on his neck as he walked toward the hotel. Jack was 45 now, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that deepened when he squinted in the sunlight. People said he looked serious, and he guessed they were right. Life hadn't given him much to smile about lately. The Pinewood Hotel was an old 3-story building with a wide porch and peeling white paint. It had seen better days, but the porch was swept clean and the windows sparkled. A bell jingled as Jack pushed open the front door. The lobby was cool and smelled of lemon polish. "Hello there," called a friendly voice. A plump woman with silver hair and bright eyes looked up from behind the front desk. Her name tag read, "Mrs. Parker." "Hello," Jack said. "I'd like a room for the week, please." "Of course, dear." Mrs. Parker opened a large book. "Not many visitors this time of year. You're in luck. We have plenty of rooms. What brings you to our little town?" "Work," Jack said. "I'm here to build some cabinets for the new doctor's office." "Oh, you must be working for Dr. Wilson. Lovely man. We're so glad to have a new doctor in town." Mrs. Parker beamed as she pushed a form across the desk. "Just fill this out for me." Jack wrote his information on the form. Name, address, phone number. Simple facts that told nothing about his life. "Will room 212 be all right?" "It's on the 2nd floor, nice and quiet, with a view of the town square." "That's fine." Jack handed back the form. Mrs. Parker gave him an old-fashioned key attached to a wooden tag. "Breakfast is from 6 to 9, and there's coffee in the lobby all day. If you need anything, just let me know." "Thank you." Jack picked up his bag and headed for the stairs. The hotel was quiet. A couple of doors were open on the 1st floor, with cleaning carts outside. Jack climbed the creaky wooden stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway was dim, with faded floral wallpaper and a worn carpet runner down the center. Room 212 was at the end of the hall. The key turned stiffly in the lock. Jack pushed the door open and set his bag down just inside. The room was simple, but clean. A double bed with a blue quilt, a wooden desk and chair by the window, a small bathroom with white tiles. Better than some of the places he'd stayed for work. Jack opened the window to let in some fresh air. From here, he could see the town square with its wooden benches and old oak trees. A few people walked along the sidewalks, stopping to chat with neighbors. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else, not like the city where Jack lived. In his apartment building, he barely knew his neighbors' names. Sometimes he went days without talking to anyone except clients or the cashier at the grocery store. Jack didn't mind being alone. At least, that's what he told himself. He unpacked his few clothes and put them in the dresser drawers. Then he took out his toiletry bag and placed it in the bathroom. Jack didn't bring much when he traveled. He'd learned to live simply after the divorce 5 years ago. Back in the main room, Jack noticed the desk had a small lamp and a pad of hotel stationery. He'd need to draw up some measurements for tomorrow's job. Maybe after dinner, he'd make some sketches. Jack walked over to the desk and pulled out the chair. That's when he saw it. A small picture frame sat at the back of the desk, half hidden by the lamp. Jack frowned. Had the hotel staff left it behind? Or did it belong to the last guest? He picked up the frame. It was simple, made of dark wood. The photo inside showed a young man in his 20s, standing in front of a building. He was smiling, one hand raised in a wave. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, his dark hair falling across his forehead. Jack's hands began to shake. He knew that smile. He knew that face. It was older than when he'd last seen it, but he would recognize it anywhere. "Tommy," he whispered. The photo slipped from Jack's trembling fingers and clattered onto the desk. He stared at it, unable to believe what he was seeing. His younger brother, who had disappeared 20 years ago after a terrible fight with their father. His brother, who had walked out the door at 16 and never came back. Jack sank into the desk chair, his legs suddenly weak. How was this possible? How could a photo of Tommy be here, in this random hotel room, in a town Jack had never visited before? He picked up the photo again, carefully this time. Yes, it was definitely Tommy, but older than when he'd left home. Maybe in his mid-20s in this picture. His brother would be 36 now, if he was still alive. Jack touched the EBE glass over Tommy's face. Where had he been all these years? Why had he never reached out? And most importantly, why was his photo here in room 212 of the Pinewood Hotel? Jack's mind raced with questions. He stared at the photo as the afternoon light faded and shadows crept across the room. Outside, the town of Pinewood went about its quiet evening routine, unaware that Jack Miller's world had just been turned upside down. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the photo of Tommy. The lamp cast a warm glow over the room, but Jack felt cold inside. 20 years. 20 years of wondering where his brother was, if he was okay, if he was even alive. "Tommy," Jack whispered again, tracing his brother's face through the glass. The last time he saw Tommy, they had both been yelling. Their father had been drinking again, and Tommy had talked back. Things got ugly fast. Jack tried to step between them, but Tommy pushed him away. "I don't need your help," Tommy had said, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "I don't need anyone." Next morning, Tommy was gone. No note, no goodbye. Just an empty bed and some missing clothes. Jack was 25 then, with his own apartment and a job at a construction company. He should have let Tommy stay with him. He should have done more. The guilt had never really gone away. Jack placed the photo on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, memories washing over him like waves. Tommy teaching him to fish when they were kids, even though Jack was the older one. Tommy was always better at outdoor stuff. Jack remembered how they used to build forts in the woods behind their house, dragging branches and old blankets to make their hideout. They would stay there for hours, eating candy bars and reading comic books until the sun went down. After their mom died, when Jack was 14 and Tommy was 5, things changed. Their dad changed. The happy times got fewer, the hard times more common. But Jack and Tommy still had each other, until they didn't. Jack sat up and picked up the photo again. Tommy looked happy in the picture, healthy. His smile reached his eyes, something Jack hadn't seen in the years before he left. The building behind Tommy looked like some kind of store, with a green awning and a display window. Jack squinted, trying to make out the name on the awning, but it was too blurry. How did this photo end up in this hotel room? Did Tommy live in Pinewood? The thought made Jack's heart beat faster. Could his brother still be here, in this small town? After all these years, could finding him really be this simple? Jack needed answers. He tucked the photo into his shirt pocket and headed downstairs to the lobby. Mrs. Parker was still at the front desk, reading a paperback novel. She looked up when Jack approached. "Everything all right with your room, Mr. Miller?" she asked. "Yes, it's fine," Jack said. He took a deep breath and pulled out the photo. "I found this in my room. Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Parker put on her reading glasses and peered at the photo. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Where did you find this?" "On the desk in room 212, Jack said. "It was in a small frame." Mrs. Parker frowned. "That's odd. The rooms are always checked carefully between guests." She looked at the photo more closely. "Wait a minute. I recognize this young man." Jack's pulse quickened. "You do?" "Yes, I believe so." Mrs. Parker nodded slowly. "That's Thomas. He stayed at the hotel about 10 years ago." "Thomas?" Jack's voice cracked. "Thomas Miller?" Mrs. Parker looked surprised. "Yes, I think that was his name. Do you know him?" "Thank you," Jack said. "I'll go there now." "The diner closes at 8, Mrs. Parker called after him as he headed for the door. "It's just past 7 now, so you should catch Bill before he closes up." Jack nodded his thanks and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, and most of the shops on Main Street were closed. But across the street, he could see the lights of Wilson's place still on. A red neon sign buzzed in the window, and a few people sat at the counter inside. Jack crossed the street, his mind racing. If Tommy had lived here, worked here, other people must remember him. Maybe someone knew where he went next. For the first time in years, Jack felt a tiny spark of hope. The bell jingled as Jack entered the diner. The place smelled of coffee and pie. An older man with a white apron was wiping down the counter. Only 3 customers remained: an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie, and a woman in a nurse's uniform drinking coffee while reading a book. "Be with you in a sec," the man called. He finished wiping the counter and came over to where Jack stood. His name tag read, Bill Wilson. "What can I get you?" Bill asked. "Actually," Jack said, "I was hoping you could help me with something." He pulled out the photo of Tommy. "Do you recognize this man?" Bill put on reading glasses that hung from a cord around his neck. He studied the photo, then looked up at Jack with new interest. "Sure do. That's Thomas Miller. Haven't seen him in years, though." His eyes narrowed. "You look familiar. You related to him?" "I'm his brother," Jack said. "Jack Miller." Bill's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be. Thomas mentioned a brother once or twice." He motioned to a stool at the counter. "Have a seat. Coffee's fresh." Jack sat down, and Bill poured him a cup of coffee. "What can you tell me about my brother?" Jack asked. "When was the last time you saw him?" Bill leaned against the counter, thinking. "Must be 8 years ago now. He worked at the lumber mill for about 2 years. Good worker, from what I heard. Came in here most mornings for breakfast." Bill smiled slightly. "Always ordered the same thing. 3 eggs over easy, hash browns, and white toast." "That sounds like Tommy," Jack said, remembering how his brother could eat twice his weight and never gain an ounce. Did he ever talk about his family? About why he was here? Bill shrugged. Not much. He kept pretty quiet about his past. Said once that he and his family had lost touch. Didn't go into details. Bill gave Jack a careful look. He seemed to be running from something, if you don't mind me saying. Jack nodded, a knot forming in his throat. Do you know where he went? When he left town? Bill wiped his hands on his apron. He said he was heading west. Wanted to see the ocean. The diner owner hesitated. But there's something else you should know. Jack leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. What is it? Bill glanced at the few remaining customers, then lowered his voice. Thomas left town suddenly. No goodbyes, no notice at the mill. Just packed up and disappeared overnight. Sounds familiar, Jack said with a sad smile. That's how he left home, too. The thing is, Bill continued, it was right after the bank robbery. Bank robbery? Bill nodded. First one in Pinewood's history. 2 men broke into the bank one night, cracked the safe, and took nearly $50,000. He poured himself a cup of coffee. No one was hurt, but it shook up the town pretty bad. This was before we had security cameras everywhere. Jack's stomach tightened. You don't think Tommy was involved? Bill shrugged. I never said that. Sheriff Miller, no relation to you, I assume, questioned everyone who suddenly left town around that time. Your brother was one of them. But there was no evidence linking him to the robbery. Tommy wasn't perfect, Jack said, but he wasn't a thief. I'm just telling you what happened, Bill said. People talk in a small town. Some folks wondered. Thomas kept to himself, never talked much about his past. Makes people curious. Jack stared into his coffee cup. Could Tommy have been involved in something like that? The brother he knew was wild, but not criminal. Then again, people change in 20 years. There was a girl, Bill added, almost as an afterthought. Jack looked up. A girl? Sarah Lawson. She worked at the library. She and Thomas were close. If anyone knows where he went, it might be her. Is she still in town? Bill nodded. Married. Now, Sarah Collins. Lives out on Maple Street. Has 2 kids. He took a sip of his coffee. The library's closed now, but it opens at 9 tomorrow morning. Thank you, Jack said. He reached for his wallet, but Bill waved him off. First cups on the house. For Thomas's brother. Jack thanked him again and left the diner. The street was quiet now, most shops dark. He walked slowly back to the hotel, thinking about what Bill had told him. A bank robbery, a girl named Sarah, Tommy heading west to see the ocean, small pieces of his brother's life that didn't quite fit together. Back in his room, Jack sat on the bed and stared at the photo of Tommy. Who had left it here? And why? It couldn't be just a coincidence that Jack was assigned this exact room. Someone must have known he was coming to Pinewood. But who? And how would they know Jack and Tommy were brothers? Jack had a different last address than when Tommy knew him. He'd moved 3 times since his divorce. None of it made sense. Jack placed the photo on the nightstand and got ready for bed. Tomorrow, he would go to the library and find Sarah Collins. Maybe she could fill in some of the blanks. That night, Jack dreamed of Tommy. Not the grown-up Tommy from the photo, but the little brother who used to follow him everywhere. In the dream, they were fishing at the creek near their childhood home. The sun was warm, the water clear. Tommy kept trying to tell Jack something important, but his voice was drowned out by the rushing water. Jack woke up feeling unsettled. The dream fading, but the feeling of urgency remaining. After a quick breakfast at the hotel, Jack walked to the Pinewood Public Library. It was a small brick building with white columns nestled between the post office and a coffee shop. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of books and furniture polish. A woman in her mid-30s sat at the front desk, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked up and smiled as Jack approached. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you find something?" "Are you Sarah Collins?" Jack asked. The woman's smile dimmed slightly. "Yes, I am. Do I know you?" "No," Jack said. "My name is Jack Miller. I'm looking for information about my brother, Tommy, Thomas Miller." "I was told you knew him." Sarah's expression changed instantly. The professional smile vanished, replaced by something more complex. Surprise, then recognition, followed by caution. "You're Tommy's brother," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jack said. "I haven't seen him in 20 years. I found out yesterday that he lived in Pinewood for a while." Sarah glanced around the quiet library. A few elderly patrons browsed the shelves, and a teenage volunteer arranged magazines on a rack. "My break is in 15 minutes, she said. "Can you wait? We could talk in the garden behind the library." Jack nodded. "I'll wait." He browsed the shelves while waiting, not really seeing the book titles. His mind was on Sarah's reaction. She clearly remembered Tommy. The question was, how much would she be willing to share? Exactly 15 minutes later, Sarah approached him. "Follow me," she said quietly. She led him through a door at the back of the library into a small garden, with a few benches and flower beds. A large oak tree provided shade. Sarah sat on one of the benches and motioned for Jack to join her. "I haven't heard Tommy's name in years," she said. "How did you find out he was here?" Jack took out the photo and handed it to her. "I found this in my hotel room yesterday. Room 212 at the Pinewood Hotel." Sarah took the photo, her fingers trembling slightly. "I took this," she said, surprise in her voice. "Outside Grayson's Hardware. Tommy had just helped Mr. Grayson install a new display window." She looked up at Jack. "How did it get in your hotel room?" "I was hoping you might know," Jack said. Sarah shook her head. "I haven't seen this photo in years. I gave it to Tommy before he left town." She handed it back to Jack. "This is very strange." "I need to find him," Jack said. "Can you help me? Do you know where he went after he left Pinewood?" Sarah was quiet. For a moment, studying Jack's face, as if looking for something. Finally, she sighed. "Tommy talked about you sometimes. He said you were the steady one, the responsible one. He admired you, even though he never said it to your face." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "I tried to find him after he left home. I really did." "I believe you," Sarah said. "Tommy was complicated. He carried a lot of pain inside." She twisted the wedding ring on her finger. "We were close for a while. I thought maybe—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "But Tommy wasn't ready to settle down. He had too many demons chasing him." "Did he tell you where he was going when he left?" "Oregon," Sarah said. "He wanted to work in the forests there. He always loved the woods." She hesitated. "But Jack, that was 8 years ago. He could be anywhere by now." "What about the bank robbery?" Jack asked. "Bill Wilson mentioned it happened right before Tommy left town." Sarah's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Tommy had nothing to do with that. That's just small-town gossip. He left because—" She stopped, looking away. "Because of what?" Jack pressed. Sarah met his eyes again. "He saw your father in town." Jack stared at her, stunned. "Our father came to Pinewood?" Sarah nodded. "Tommy never explained how your father found him." but seeing him brought back all the bad memories. Tommy left that night. Jack sat back, trying to process this new information. Their father had tracked Tommy to Pinewood? The same father who had told Jack to forget about his brother. That Tommy was dead to them now? It didn't make sense. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "Tommy used to stay at the Pinewood Hotel when he first came to town, before he got a place of his own. He always stayed in room 212. A chill ran down Jack's spine. "The same room I'm in now." Sarah nodded. He said it reminded him of his bedroom back home. The way the morning light came through the window. Jack remembered how Tommy's room used to fill with golden light in the early mornings. Their mom used to say, Tommy had the sunniest room for the sunniest boy. Before he could ask another question, Sarah checked her watch. "I need to get back to work," she said, standing up. "But you should talk to Frank Cooper. He was the handyman at the hotel back then. Tommy used to help him with repairs sometimes. Do you know where I can find him? He lives in the blue house on Pine Street, just past the church." Sarah started walking back to the library door, then stopped and turned. "Jack, if you find Tommy, tell him I hope he found what he was looking for." Jack nodded, watching as Sarah disappeared back into the library. He sat in the garden for a few more minutes, thinking about everything she had told him. Their father had come to Pinewood. Tommy had run again. And somehow, 20 years after Tommy first disappeared, Jack had been assigned the very hotel room that his brother had once called home. Too many coincidences. Something or someone was connecting the dots, leading Jack along a path. But to where? And why now, after all these years? Jack left the library garden and walked back to the hotel. He had planned to start work on the doctor's office cabinets today, but his mind was too full of Tommy to focus on measuring and cutting wood. He called Dr. Wilson and explained that something personal had come up. Could he start tomorrow instead? The doctor was understanding and agreed to the delay. Back in room 212, Jack looked around with new eyes. This had been Tommy's room. His brother had slept in this bed, looked out this window, sat at this desk. Jack ran his hand over the wooden desk surface, wondering if Tommy had carved his initials somewhere hidden, the way he used to do as a kid. Jack suddenly felt like he was missing something important. He began to search the room more carefully. He looked under the bed, inside the drawers, behind the pictures on the walls. He checked the closet, running his hands along the shelves and walls. Nothing. Frustrated, Jack sat in the desk chair and leaned back. The chair wobbled slightly. He looked down and noticed that one of the legs seemed shorter than the others. When he tipped the chair to examine it, he saw something stuck to the bottom. A folded piece of paper secured with a small piece of tape that had yellowed with age. Jack's heart beat faster as he carefully removed the paper. It had been folded into a small square and sealed with tape. He opened it slowly, afraid it might tear. It was a letter, written in faded blue ink on hotel stationery. The handwriting was familiar, slightly messy but readable. Tommy's handwriting. "Dear Jack," it began. Jack's hands trembled as he read. "Dear Jack, if you're reading this, you've somehow found your way to Pinewood and to this room. I don't know how or when, but I've always believed our paths would cross again someday. I ended up in this town by chance. My truck broke down, and I didn't have money to fix it. The people here were kind, especially Mrs. Parker at the hotel and Bill at the diner. I found work at the lumber mill and decided to stay for a while. I've thought about calling you so many times. I even looked up your number once, but I couldn't do it. I was too ashamed of how I left, too afraid you would be angry. Or worse, that You wouldn't care at all. I heard Dad died last year. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Not for him, but for you. You shouldn't have had to deal with that alone. Were you alone, Jack? I hope not. I hope you found someone who makes you happy. I'm leaving Pinewood tomorrow. Dad showed up here somehow. I saw him outside the diner and just ran. I'm still running, I guess. Some things never change. I don't know where I'll go next. West, probably. I've never seen the ocean. But I want you to know I'm okay. I've grown up a lot since I was that angry kid who stormed out. I have regrets, but I'm trying to be better. Maybe someday we'll meet again, and I can tell you everything in person. Until then, know that I miss you, big brother. I'll be at the place where we made our pact on the day we made it, every year, just in case. Love, Tommy. The letter was dated 5 years ago. Jack read it 3 times, his vision blurring with tears. Tommy had written this letter for him, hidden it in this room, hoping that somehow, someday, Jack would find it. The place where we made our pact, Jack whispered. He knew exactly where that was. The big oak tree by the river near their childhood home. When Jack was 12 and Tommy was 3, they had carved their names into the trunk and made a solemn promise to always be brothers, no matter what. They renewed the pact when Jack turned 21, adding the date, July 15th, 2000. Jack checked the date on his phone, July 13th, 2025. In 2 days, it would be July 15th, the anniversary of their pact. If Tommy had kept his promise, he would be at the oak tree in 2 days. Jack's mind raced. His childhood home was in Cedar Creek, almost 6 hours away by bus. If he left tomorrow, he could make it there by the 15th. But what about his job for Dr. Wilson? Jack had given his word that he would build those cabinets. He couldn't just leave, but he couldn't miss this chance to find Tommy either. Jack paced the small hotel room, trying to decide what to do. Finally, he picked up his phone and called Dr. Wilson again. Dr. Wilson, I'm very sorry, but I have a family emergency, Jack explained. I need to leave town for a few days. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything all right? The doctor asked. I hope it will be, Jack said honestly. I've just learned that my brother, who I haven't seen in 20 years, might be waiting for me. I need to go to him. I understand, Dr. Wilson said. Family comes first. The cabinets can wait until you return. Thank you, Jack said, relieved. I'll make this up to you, I promise. After hanging up, Jack checked the bus schedule. There was a bus to Cedar Creek early the next morning. He would be cutting it close, but he could make it in time. Jack carefully folded Tommy's letter and put it in his wallet. Then he began to pack his few belongings. As he worked, he felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name: hope, fear, excitement, doubt. What if Tommy didn't show up? What if he did? But he was. Nothing like the brother Jack remembered? 20 years was a long time, but Jack had to try. He had missed too many chances already. He wouldn't miss this one. Jack woke up before his alarm the next morning. He had barely slept, his mind too busy with thoughts of Tommy and the strange path that had led him to that letter. He showered quickly and double-checked his bag to make sure he had everything. The photo of Tommy was carefully tucked into his wallet next to the letter. Before leaving, Jack went to the front desk to check out. Mrs. Parker was already there, despite the early hour. "Leaving us so soon, Mr. Miller?" she asked, looking surprised. "I thought you were staying the week." "Something came up," Jack explained. "A family matter. I need to go home for a few days, but I'll be back to finish the job for Dr. Wilson." Mrs. Parker nodded. "I hope everything's all right." Jack hesitated, then took out the photo of Tommy. "Mrs. Parker, do you know who might have left this photo in room 212? She studied the photo again, adjusting her glasses. "I'm not sure. That room was cleaned last week after a guest checked out." She thought for a moment. Come to think of it, it was an unusual situation. A man paid for 2 weeks, but only stayed 1. Quiet fellow, kept to himself. "Do you remember his name?" Jack asked, his pulse quickening. Mrs. Parker checked her register. "Mr. Smith," she said. "At least, that's what he wrote down. Paid in cash." "What did he look like?" "Older gentleman, maybe in his 60s. Gray hair, glasses. Nothing remarkable about him." Jack didn't recognize the description. It wasn't Tommy, and it couldn't be their father, who had died years ago. Another mystery to add to the growing list. "Thank you for everything," Jack said, handing her his key. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Parker said, with a kind smile. The bus station was only a block away. Jack arrived, with 20 minutes to spare before the 7:15 bus to Cedar Creek. There were only a few other passengers waiting: a young mother with a sleeping toddler, an elderly couple with matching suitcases, and a teenager wearing headphones. Jack sat on a hard plastic chair and called his boss at the carpentry company. He explained that he needed a few more days off for a family emergency. His boss wasn't happy, but Jack had never asked for time off before, so he reluctantly agreed. The bus arrived right on time. Jack found a seat by the window and watched as Pinewood disappeared behind them. The town that had been nothing to him 2 days ago was now a place he would never forget. It was a piece of the puzzle of Tommy's life, a chapter Jack had known nothing about until now. As the bus rolled through the countryside, Jack's mind wandered back to their childhood. He remembered teaching Tommy how to ride a bike, running alongside the wobbling two-wheeler until Tommy found his balance. He remembered how Tommy had stood up to the neighborhood bully who was picking on Jack, even though Tommy was half the bully's size. His little brother had always been brave. The landscape outside the window changed from small towns to open fields to forests. Jack watched it all pass by in a blur of green and blue. The bus stopped in several towns along the way, people getting on and off. Jack barely noticed. His thoughts were too full of the past and the possibility that tomorrow, after 20 long years, he might see his brother again. What would Tommy look like now? The photo Jack had found showed him in his 20s. He would be 36 now. Would Jack even recognize him? Would Tommy recognize Jack, with his graying hair and the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before? As the hours passed, Jack's mind filled with questions. Why had Tommy never tried to contact him directly? Why the elaborate scheme with the photo and the hidden letter? And who was the mysterious Mr. Smith who had stayed in room 212 for just one night? None of it made sense, yet somehow Jack was being led back to the oak tree by the river, to the place where two brothers had once promised to always be there for each other. A promise that life had broken in so many ways. The bus rolled into Cedar Creek just after 6 in the evening. The town looked smaller than Jack remembered, the main street lined with shops that had changed names and purposes over the years. The hardware store where their father used to work was now a coffee shop. The ice cream parlor, where they used to get treats on hot summer days, was gone, replaced by a cell phone store. Jack felt like a stranger in the place where he had grown up. He hadn't been back since their father's funeral 5 years ago, and even then, he had only stayed one night, eager to get away from the memories that haunted every corner of this town. The only motel in Cedar Creek was on the edge of town, a small place with a blinking neon sign and a gravel parking lot. Jack checked in and was given a key to room 7. The room was basic: a bed, a dresser, a small TV on the wall. Nothing like the charm of the Pinewood Hotel, but it would do for a night or two. Jack set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by doubt. What was he doing here? Chasing a ghost, following a trail of breadcrumbs that might lead nowhere. Tommy might not show up tomorrow. He might have written that letter years ago and long since stopped coming to the oak tree. Jack might be setting himself up for another disappointment in a life that had seen too many already. But even as these thoughts circled in his mind, Jack knew he would be at that oak tree tomorrow. He had to be. If there was even the smallest chance of finding Tommy, he had to take it. Jack went out and found a small diner that was still open. He wasn't really hungry, but he knew he should eat something. The waitress brought him a burger and fries that he barely tasted. His mind was elsewhere, already at the oak tree by the river, already imagining the moment when he might see Tommy walking through the trees. After dinner, Jack walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Creek. Without really meaning to, he found himself on Elm Street, standing across from their childhood home. It looked different now, painted a soft yellow instead of the white he remembered. The big maple tree in the front yard was gone, probably taken down years ago. But the porch swing was still there, hanging from the same hooks. Jack watched as a young couple played with a little girl in the front yard. She was running through a sprinkler, squealing with delight as her parents laughed. Once, that had been Jack and Tommy, playing while their mother watched from the porch. Before everything fell apart. Jack turned away, unable to watch anymore. He walked back to the motel, his steps heavy. In his room, he took out Tommy's letter and read it again, clinging to the hope in those faded words. "I'll be at the place where we made our pact, on the day we made it, every year, just in case." Tomorrow was July 15th. Tomorrow, Jack would find out if Tommy had kept his promise. He lay down on the bed, still in his clothes, and closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of running through woods, always chasing someone just ahead of him, someone he could never quite reach. Jack woke to sunlight streaming through the thin motel curtains. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then it all came flooding back. Pinewood, the photo, Tommy's letter, the journey to Cedar Creek. And what day it was. July 15th. Today, he might see his brother again. Jack showered and dressed quickly. He put on his best shirt, a blue button-down that his ex-wife once said brought out his eyes. He wasn't sure why that mattered, but somehow it did. He wanted Tommy to see him at his best. Outside, the day was clear and warm, a perfect summer morning in Cedar Creek. Jack walked to a small cafe for breakfast, where he forced himself to eat, despite the nervous knot in his stomach. The oak tree was about 3 miles from town, on the edge of what used to be Old Man Wilson's property. Jack figured he should head out there around noon. That would give him plenty of time to find the tree, which he hadn't seen in more than 20 years. With hours to kill, Jack decided to walk through his hometown. So much had changed, yet so much remained the same. The library where he and Tommy used to spend rainy afternoons still stood on the corner of Main and Elm, its brick facade unchanged. The park where they played baseball had new equipment, but the baseball diamond looked just as he remembered it. Jack found himself walking past his old high school, a sprawling brick building that had aged well. Tommy never made it to high school. Here, he was gone before then. Jack wondered if Tommy had finished school somewhere else, or if he'd dropped out completely. There were so many things he didn't know about his brother's life. 20 years of birthdays and Christmases and everyday moments, all lost to them. Could those years ever be bridged? Was it even possible to know someone again after so much time? Jack's feet carried him to the Cedar Creek Cemetery without him really planning to go there. He walked through the rows of headstones until he found the ones he was looking for. Margaret Miller, beloved wife and mother, 1955–2000, and beside her, Richard Miller, 1953–2020, their parents, side by side in death, as they had rarely been in life. After their mother died, their father had changed, becoming bitter and angry, turning to alcohol to numb his pain. Jack had escaped as soon as he could, moving out at 18. Tommy had endured 4 more years of their father's rages before he, too, fled. Jack stood before the graves, unsure what he felt. Sadness, yes, but also anger. Anger at his father for driving Tommy away. Anger at himself for not protecting his little brother better. And somewhere beneath it all, a quiet grief for all the years they had lost. "I'm trying to find him, Dad," Jack whispered. He wasn't sure if it was a promise or an accusation. Jack placed a hand on his mother's headstone. "I miss you, Mom," he said softly. "I think Tommy does too." He stayed there for a while, lost in memories, his mother's laugh, his father's rare moments of kindness before the drinking took over, Tommy's gap-toothed smile when he was small. Eventually, Jack checked his watch. It was almost 11. Time to start walking to the oak tree. The path to the river was more overgrown than Jack remembered. What had once been a clear trail was now barely visible in places, reclaimed by undergrowth and young trees. Still, Jack's feet seemed to remember the way, carrying him forward through the woods. The day had grown warmer, and Jack was sweating by the time he caught his first glimpse of the river through the trees. The water level was lower than in his memories, but the gentle sound of flowing water was just as he remembered. Now came the harder part, finding the oak tree. Jack walked along the riverbank, looking for landmarks. There used to be a large rock shaped like a turtle, and the oak tree was just beyond it. But the rock was gone, possibly washed away by floods over the years. Jack continued walking, his eyes scanning both sides of the river. Had he gone too far? Not far enough? The trees all looked the same to him now. Maybe this had been a fool's errand after all. Then, just as doubt was beginning to overwhelm him, Jack saw it. The tree was bigger, of course, 20 years bigger. But its shape was unmistakable. The massive trunk, the wide-spreading branches that reached toward the sky like open arms. Jack approached the tree slowly, his heart pounding. He placed his hand on the rough bark, feeling the solid reality of it beneath his fingers. This was the place. This was where 2 brothers had made a promise to each other. Jack walked around the trunk, searching for their carving. The bark had grown and changed over the years, and for a terrible moment, he thought it might be gone. Then he found it, higher up than he remembered. The tree had grown taller, lifting their names with it. Jack Y. Tommy Miller. Brothers Forever. July 15th, 2000. The carving was weathered but still legible. Jack traced the letters with his fingers, just as he had the day they carved them. Tommy had been so proud to use the pocket knife, his small face serious with concentration as he worked on each letter. Jack checked his watch again. It was just past noon. He settled himself with his back against the tree, just as they used to sit when they were boys, and prepared to wait. The day was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The river flowed gently, its surface gleaming. Birds called from the trees, and occasionally a fish jumped in the river, sending ripples across the water. Hours passed. Jack tried not to check his watch too often, but he couldn't help himself. 1 o'clock? 2 o'clock? 3. No sign of Tommy. Doubt crept in again. Maybe Tommy had stopped coming years ago. Maybe he had never come at all. The letter could have been written on a day when Tommy felt nostalgic, but he might have changed his mind about the yearly visits. Jack leaned his head back against the tree and closed his eyes. He thought about Tommy's face in the photo, older than the boy he remembered, but with the same eyes, the same half-smile. Somewhere out there, his brother was living a life Jack knew nothing about. They were strangers now, connected only by shared blood and childhood memories. Jack must have dozed off because he woke with a start to the sound of a breaking twig. The sun was lower now. He looked at his watch. 4:15 p.m. Then he heard footsteps in the woods. Jack stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps were getting closer. He peered into the trees, trying to see who was coming. The afternoon sun was in his eyes, making it hard to see clearly. "Hello?" Jack called, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Tommy?" The footsteps paused, then continued, slower now. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't Tommy. A man in his 70s stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a walking stick. He wore jeans and a faded flannel shirt. His white hair was neatly trimmed, and his face was deeply tanned, like someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. "Sorry to disturb you," the old man said. "I was just taking my afternoon walk." He looked at Jack curiously. "Don't get many visitors out this way." "I'm waiting for someone," Jack said, trying to hide his disappointment. "My brother," the old man nodded. "Mind if I rest a bit? These old legs aren't what they used to be." Without waiting for an answer, he lowered himself onto a fallen log near the oak tree. Jack sat back down against the tree, unsure what to say. He hadn't expected company. "This is a special place," the old man said, looking around. "Used to bring my grandsons fishing right over there." He pointed to a bend in the river. "Always thought this oak was the king of these woods." Jack nodded. "My brother and I used to come here when we were kids." "That's so?" The old man studied Jack's face. "You from Cedar Creek?" "I grew up here, moved away a long time ago." "Miller," the old man said suddenly. "You're one of the Miller boys." Jack looked at him in surprise. "How did you know that?" The old man chuckled. "Small town. Good memory." He tapped his temple. "I was the mail carrier here for 40 years. Knew everybody." He squinted at Jack. "You're the older one. Jack, right?" Jack nodded, amazed. "And you're waiting for Tommy," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jack admitted. "We haven't seen each other in a long time." The old man was quiet for a moment, watching the river flow. "Family's a funny thing," he said finally. "Nothing more important, but nothing that can hurt you worse, either." Jack didn't respond. The old man seemed to be talking more to himself than to Jack. "My brother and I fought in Vietnam together," the old man continued. "Had a falling out after we came home. Didn't speak for 15 years. He shook his head slowly. 15 years wasted. All over something I can't even remember. Clearly now. "Did you ever make up?" Jack asked. "We did, at our mother's funeral." The old man looked at Jack directly. "Don't wait that long, son. Time goes faster than you think." They sat in silence for a while. Jack checked his watch again. 4:45 p.m. The day was slipping away, and still no sign of Tommy. "Well, I should be getting home," the old man said, rising stiffly from the log. "My daughter worries if I'm out too long." He hesitated. "I hope your brother shows up." "Thank you," Jack said. "So do I." The old man nodded and started to walk away. Then he stopped and turned back. "You know, I've walked this path almost every day for years. Never seen anyone waiting by this tree before." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Never?" The old man shook his head. "Not once." With a small wave, he disappeared back into the trees, leaving Jack alone with this new information. If the old man walked here regularly and had never seen anyone waiting by the tree, did that mean Tommy had never come? Had the promise in his letter been empty? Or had Tommy come on different days, or at different times? The afternoon stretched on. Jack skipped stones across the river, just as he and Tommy used to do. He found a perfectly flat one and managed 5 skips, the stone dancing across the water before sinking. Tommy had always been better at this, sometimes getting 8 or 9 skips. Clouds began to gather overhead, and the air felt heavy with coming rain. Jack wondered how long he should wait. Until sunset? Until it started raining? The whole night he took out Tommy's letter again and reread it, looking for clues. "I'll be at the place where we made our pact, on the day we made it. Every year, just in case." The words were clear. Today was definitely July 15th, the anniversary of their pact. This was definitely the right oak tree. Their carving proved that. So, where was Tommy? Jack walked in circles around the oak tree, growing more restless as the hours passed. The clouds darkened, and a cool breeze rippled the surface of the river. A distant rumble of thunder warned of the approaching storm. 6:30 p.m. The first drops of rain began to fall. Jack stood under the oak tree, where the thick leaves provided some shelter. But soon the rain came harder, finding its way through the branches. Jack pulled his jacket over his head and made a decision. He would wait until full dark, and if Tommy didn't come by then, he would head back to town. He could always come back tomorrow, though he doubted Tommy would show up on a different day. The rain continued, soaking through Jack's clothes. He was cold and wet and beginning to feel foolish. Maybe this whole journey had been a mistake. Maybe the photo, the letter, all of it had been nothing but a cruel joke or a strange coincidence. As darkness began to fall, Jack's hope faded with the light. Tommy wasn't coming. The old man's words echoed in his mind. He'd never seen anyone waiting by this tree. Tommy had written that letter 5 years ago, but he hadn't kept the promise it contained. Just as Jack was about to give up and head back to town, the rain suddenly stopped. The clouds parted just enough to let a single ray of evening sunlight break through, illuminating the oak tree in a golden glow. It was the kind of moment that felt magical, as if nature itself was trying to tell him something. Jack waited under that golden light, holding on to the last shred of hope. He closed his eyes for just a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. That's when he heard footsteps again. Different footsteps this time. Quicker, more purposeful. Jack's eyes snapped open, and he turned toward the sound. A tall figure was walking along the riverbank, coming toward the oak tree. Jack held his breath as the figure drew closer. The last ray of sunlight illuminated the man's face, and Jack felt his heart stop for a moment. It was Tommy. Older, different, but unmistakably his brother. Tommy was tall and lean, his once dark hair now streaked with gray at the temples. His face was tanned and weathered, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the photo Jack had found. He wore jeans, hiking boots, and a green jacket with a patch on the sleeve. He walked with confidence, his eyes fixed on the oak tree. Then he saw Jack standing there, and he froze. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the clearing, neither one moving. The only sound was the river flowing beside them and birds calling as they returned to their nests for the night. "Tommy?" Jack's voice broke on the name. Tommy took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "Jack?" His voice was deeper than Jack remembered. But it was him. It was really him. Jack moved toward his brother, his legs feeling strangely weak. They stopped a few feet apart, still staring at each other, taking in all the changes that 20 years had brought. "You came," Tommy said finally, wonder in his voice. "I found your letter," Jack said, "in room 212. Tommy smiled then, the same crooked smile from their childhood. That smile broke something open inside Jack, and he closed the distance between them, pulling his brother into a tight hug. Tommy stood stiff for just a second, then his arms came around Jack, returning the embrace with equal force. They stayed that way for a long time, neither wanting to let go. Jack felt tears on his face, but didn't care. His brother was alive. His brother was here. When they finally stepped apart, Jack saw that Tommy's eyes were wet too. "I can't believe you're really here," Tommy said, shaking his head. "All these years I've been coming, and the one time I'm almost late." "You've been coming every year?" Jack asked. "The old man who walks here said he never saw anyone." Tommy laughed. "Old man Jenkins? He walks in the mornings. I always come at sunset." He looked toward the river. "It's when we used to fish here, remember? When the light was golden on the water." Jack nodded, memories flooding back. Their mother packing them sandwiches, their father teaching them to tie fishing line, the quiet evenings by the river before everything fell apart. "Let's sit," Tommy said, gesturing to the base of the oak tree. They sat side by side, backs against the trunk, just as they used to when they were boys. "How did you find me?" Tommy asked. Jack took out the photo and handed it to his brother. "This was in my hotel room in Pinewood, room 212. Tommy stared at the photo, confusion on his face. "I lost this years ago," he said. "I've always wondered where it went." He looked up at Jack. "But how did you end up in Pinewood? In that exact room?" Jack explained about the cabinet job for Dr. Wilson, how Mrs. Parker had assigned him room 212. "It can't be a coincidence," he finished. "Someone wanted me to find that photo." "And the letter," Tommy added. "I wrote that 5 years ago, when I heard Dad died. I was drunk, feeling sorry for myself. I taped it under the chair, thinking, maybe someday you'd find it." He shook his head. "But the chances of you staying in that exact room—" "Someone must have known," Jack said. "Someone who knew about our pact, about the oak tree." They sat quietly for a moment, each lost in thought. "What happened, Tommy?" Jack finally asked. "Why did you never call or write? All these years, I thought you might be dead." Tommy sighed, a deep sound full of regret. "I was ashamed," he said simply. "At first, I was just angry. At Dad, at the world. I hitchhiked across the country, worked odd jobs, got into some trouble." He looked down at his hands. "By the time I started to get my head straight, years had passed. I thought you probably hated me for leaving like that. Or worse, that you'd forgotten all about me. I looked for you," Jack said. "For years, I looked." "I know that now," Tommy said. "But then, I just kept running. It was easier than facing everything I'd left behind." He gestured to their surroundings. Coming here once a year was my way of connecting without having to face the past. I never really expected you to show up. Until today, Jack said. Tommy nodded. Until today. Tell me about your life, Jack said. What do you do now? Where do you live? Tommy smiled. I'm a park ranger in Oregon, Crater Lake National Park. He touched the patch on his jacket sleeve, which Jack now saw was a ranger patch. Been there almost 8 years now. You always loved the outdoors, Jack said. I found my place there, Tommy agreed. The park is beautiful. Blue water, forests, mountains. I have a small cabin on the edge of the park. Nothing fancy, but it's home. He paused. What about you, Jack? Are you happy? Jack considered the question. I'm okay, he said finally. I've got my carpentry business, a small apartment. No wife. Anymore. We divorced 5 years ago. He shrugged. It's a quiet life. No kids? Tommy asked. Jack shook his head. We tried. It didn't happen. He took a deep breath. What about you? Did you ever get married? No, Tommy said. Came close once, with a woman named Claire. She was a botanist at the park. But in the end, she wanted children, a normal life. I wasn't ready. He looked at Jack. Maybe I've been running so long I don't know how to stop. The light was fading now, the forest growing dark around them. But neither brother moved to leave. What happens now? Jack asked after a while. Tommy looked at him, uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted. I never thought past this moment. Never let myself believe it would actually happen. I have 2 weeks off work, Jack said. I was planning to go back to Pinewood to finish the cabinet job, but that can wait. Tommy smiled slowly. I have some vacation time saved up. 2 weeks, actually. Maybe we could spend it together, Jack suggested. Get to know each other again. I'd like that, Tommy said. His voice was quiet, but sincere. As darkness fell around them, the two brothers sat beneath the oak tree, making plans. There was still so much to say, so many years to bridge. But for now, it was enough to sit together beside the river, listening to the water flow, just as they had when they were boys. 2 days later, Jack and Tommy were back in Pinewood. They had spent the previous day in Cedar Creek, walking around their old neighborhood, sharing memories, and filling in the gaps of their separate lives. Now, Jack wanted to show Tommy the hotel room where he had found the photo. It's strange being back here, Tommy said, as they walked up the steps of the Pinewood Hotel. I haven't been in this town for 8 years. Mrs. Parker was behind the front desk when they entered. Her eyes widened when she saw the two men. Mr. Miller, she said to Jack. Then her gaze moved to Tommy, and her face broke into a warm smile. And Thomas, my goodness, it's really you. She came around the desk and gave Tommy a hug. I always wondered what happened to you. It's good to see you too, Mrs. Parker, Tommy said, returning the hug with genuine affection. You found each other, she said, looking from one brother to the other. I'm so glad. Actually, Jack said, we were hoping to see room 212 again. Is it available? Mrs. Parker checked her register. It is indeed. Let me get you the key. She handed Jack the same old-fashioned key with the wooden tag. Take all the time you need. The brothers climbed the stairs to the second floor. Jack unlocked the door to room 212 and stepped aside to let Tommy enter first. Tommy stood in the middle of the room, looking around. It's exactly the same, he said softly. I stayed in this room for nearly a month when I first came to Pinewood. The photo was right here, Jack said, pointing to the desk, in a small frame. Tommy walked around the room, running his hand over the furniture. "This is strange," he said. "I lost that photo years ago, when I was still working at the lumber mill. I always thought it fell out of my wallet somewhere." "And you never wrote a letter and left it under the chair?" Jack asked. Tommy shook his head. "No. I thought about writing to you many times, but I never did." Jack's mind was spinning. "Then who left the photo? Who wrote the letter?" Tommy looked just as confused. "And why now, after all these years?" Jack took out the letter he had found. "Read this," he said, handing it to Tommy. "Someone wrote it, pretending to be you." Tommy sat on the edge of the bed and read the letter carefully. "This is not my handwriting," he said when he finished. "But whoever wrote it knew about our pact. And the oak tree. No one else knew about that." "Let's talk to Bill at the diner," Jack suggested. "Maybe he knows something." They found Bill Wilson wiping down tables after the lunch rush. He looked up in surprise when they walked in together. "Well, I'll be," Bill said, a smile spreading across his face. "The Miller brothers, together again." He shook both their hands. "I guess you found what you were looking for, Jack." "We did," Jack said. "But we still have questions. Someone left Tommy's photo in room 2212 and wrote a fake letter, pretending to be from Tommy. Did you have anything to do with that?" Bill shook his head. "Not me. Though I'm not surprised someone in this town remembered Thomas. He made an impression." As they were talking, an elderly man at a corner table called out to them, "Excuse me, did I hear you talking about room 212 at the Pinewood Hotel?" Jack and Tommy turned to look at him. He was in his 80s, thin with wispy white hair and thick glasses. "I couldn't help overhearing," the man said. "I think I might know something about this." The brothers exchanged a look, then walked over to the man's table. "I'm Frank Cooper," the old man said, extending a trembling hand. "I used to be the handyman at the Pinewood Hotel for 30 years. "I remember you," Tommy said, shaking his hand. "You showed me how to fix the radiator in my room." Frank smiled. "That's right. You were a quick learner." He gestured for them to sit down. There was a guest who stayed in room 212 every July for years, always the same dates, July 14th to 16. He would ask if a young man named Thomas Miller had been back to town. "Every year?" Jack asked, leaning forward. "Who was he?" Frank hesitated, looking from Jack to Tommy and back again. "He said he was your father." Jack felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. "That's impossible. Our father died 5 years ago." "That's what he told me last year," Frank said, nodding. "He said he was very ill and wouldn't be able to come back. That's when he asked me to leave something in the room for when his son Jack came." Our father came looking for Tommy? Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. "The same father who told me Tommy was dead to us after he ran away?" "Did you know our father, Mr. Cooper?" Tommy asked, his voice tight. "Not well," Frank admitted. "He was a quiet man, kept to himself, but he came faithfully every year. He would sit in that room, waiting, as if he thought Thomas might just walk in." Jack and Tommy looked at each other, stunned. Their father, who they thought had never cared enough to look for Tommy, had been searching for years. "He gave me an envelope last year," Frank continued. "Told me to put it in room 2212 if a man named Jack Miller ever came to Pinewood. Said I'd know when the time was right." The old man shook his head. "I forgot all about it until last week, when a man checked into the hotel and then checked out just a day later. He looked so much like your father, it jogged my memory." "Mr. Smith," Jack said, remembering what Mrs. Parker had told him. Frank nodded. "That's the name he used. paid me to put the photo and letter in room 212 before you arrived." "Who was he?" Tommy asked. "He didn't say," Frank replied. "But he knew exactly when you would be coming, Jack. And he knew which room to put you in." Jack's mind was reeling. Someone who looked like their father had arranged for him to find the photo and letter, which had led him to Tommy. But who? And why? "Do you think Dad wrote the letter, but made it look like it was from me?" Tommy asked. "Jack." "It would explain how the writer knew about the oak tree," Jack said slowly. "Dad knew about our pact. He caught us sneaking out to the river that day." Tommy was quiet, processing this information. "So, Dad was searching for me all those years," he said finally. "I never knew." "Neither did I," Jack said. The revelation was shaking everything he thought he knew about their father. Frank Cooper rose shakily to his feet. "I've said all I know," he told them. "But I'm glad to see you boys together again. Your father would be pleased." As the old man walked away, Jack and Tommy sat in silence, trying to make sense of what they had just learned. "I don't understand," Tommy said finally, breaking the silence. "Dad always said he never wanted to see me again. Why would he spend years looking for me?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know. After you left, he refused to even say your name. He told me to forget I ever had a brother." "But he came here, to Pinewood," Tommy said. "How did he even find me?" They paid for coffee and walked outside into the afternoon sunshine. The town of Pinewood looked different to Jack now. No longer a random stop for work, but a place that held pieces of his family's story. "Let's go back to the hotel," Jack suggested. "Maybe there's something else in room 212 that we missed." In the room, the brothers searched more carefully. They looked behind pictures, under the mattress, inside the desk drawers. Jack even checked under the chair again, hoping to find another letter. Nothing. Tommy sat on the bed, staring at the letter Jack had found. "Dad knew I'd never reach out to you directly," he said. "So he created this whole setup to bring us together." "But why didn't he just tell me where you were?" Jack asked, sitting beside his brother. "Why the elaborate scheme?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Maybe he knew I wouldn't want to see him," he said finally. "But he knew we needed each other." Jack thought about that. Their father had been a difficult man, harsh, often cruel, especially after their mother died. But had there been love there too? Buried beneath the anger and the alcohol? "The man who brought the photo and letter last week," Jack said. "Frank said he looked like Dad." "A relative, maybe?" Tommy suggested. "Dad had a cousin in Montana. They looked similar." Jack nodded. "Could be. Dad must have arranged it before he died. Someone to finish what he started if he couldn't." As evening approached, Jack and Tommy walked to a small park in the center of town. They sat on a bench, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "What happens now?" Jack asked, echoing the question from the oak tree. Tommy looked thoughtful. "I have to go back to Oregon eventually. My job, my life is there." He turned to Jack. "But I don't want to lose you again." "You won't," Jack promised. "We'll stay in touch this time. Phone calls, visits. No more disappearing." Tommy smiled. "I'd like that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From inside, he carefully removed a worn photograph. "I've carried this with me everywhere," he admitted, handing it to Jack. It was a photo of Jack from 20 years ago, standing in front of his first apartment, smiling proudly. Jack had forgotten it was even taken. "Where did you get this?" Jack asked, surprised. "I took it with me when I left home," Tommy said. "It was the only picture I had of you." He gestured to the photo of himself that Jack had found. "Seems like we've both been carrying each other all these years." Jack handed Tommy the photo from room 212. "I think this belongs to you." Tommy took it, looking at his younger self with a sad smile. "I've changed a lot since then." "We both have," Jack said. They sat in companionable silence as night fell fully over Pinewood. The street lamps came on, casting pools of golden light on the sidewalks. A few people walked by, nodding friendly greetings to the brothers. "You know what's strange?" Tommy said after a while. "If Dad hadn't come looking for me in Pinewood, I might never have left. I might still be working at the lumber mill, living in some small apartment in town. And if Dad hadn't arranged for me to find that photo and letter, I would never have come looking for you," Jack added. "I would have finished the cabinets for Dr. Wilson and gone home, never knowing you were just a day's journey away." Tommy nodded slowly. "Our father's final gift to us," he said softly. "Not what I expected from him," Jack admitted. "People can." "Surprise you," Tommy said. "Maybe he changed toward the end, or maybe he always cared more than he could show." As they walked back to the hotel, Jack thought about the strange path that had led them here. A random work assignment, a lost photo, a hidden letter, a father's last act of love. Some might call it chance, but Jack knew better. Some bonds could never be truly broken, not by time or distance or even death. The next morning, Jack and Tommy checked out of the Pinewood Hotel. They had decided to spend a few days in Cedar Creek, revisiting places from their childhood before Tommy returned to Oregon and Jack went back to his life in the city. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Parker," Jack said as they handed in their key. Mrs. Parker smiled at the brothers standing side by side. "It does my heart good to see you two together," she said. "Some stories have happy endings after all." Outside, in the morning sunlight, Tommy turned to Jack. "Where to first, big brother?" Jack smiled at the familiar phrase from their childhood. "Anywhere you want, little brother," he replied, just as he used to. As they walked down the street together, Jack felt something settle inside him, a piece falling into place that had been missing for 20 years. The journey wasn't over. They had years of catching up to do, new memories to create, but they had found their way back to each other, guided by the invisible hand of a father they thought had stopped caring long ago. Some stories don't end, Jack thought. They just find new ways to begin. That was the end of The Forgotten Room, a story of family bonds that can never truly be broken. Where are you listening from today? If you enjoyed this emotional journey of two brothers finding their way back to each other, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Don't forget to share with friends and family who might need a reminder about the importance of reconnection and forgiveness. Together, we can spread kindness and awareness through the power of storytelling. Thank you for listening.